The cold seeped through the worn wool of her cloak, a familiar ache that settled deep in the bones of her bad leg. Ilara sat on an overturned fishing boat, the splintered wood a welcome hardness against her back, and watched the children. Their laughter was a spray of bright color against the gray canvas of the sky, the sea, and the shingle beach. They were the only real warmth in her world. Her life was a collection of muted tones. The damp salt air of the coastal village of Saltwind, the perpetual chill of the stone cottage she shared with two other women who barely spoke to her, the constant, grinding pain in her right hip. An injury from childhood, a fall that never healed right, had left her with a limp that defined her more than her own name. She was the lame girl, the one who couldn't help haul the heavy nets or climb the cliffs to the watchtower. So she watched the children. It was a duty no one else wanted, keeping the youngest ones from toddling into the greedy surf while their parents worked. For Ilara, it was a reprieve. Here, with them, she was just Ilara, the one who could find the smoothest skipping stones and knew the names of all the seabirds. The fog was rolling in, thick and silent, swallowing the horizon. It crept over the water like a phantom, blurring the line between sea and sky. The children's laughter faltered, their small forms huddling closer together. The fog carried a deeper cold, a stillness that felt wrong. Then she saw it. At the far end of the beach, where the black rocks clawed their way out of the sea, a shape emerged from the mist. It was massive, a shadow-given form, four-legged and hulking. Its fur was the color of a starless night, absorbing the meager light. It was the beast. Fear, sharp and icy, lanced through her. Every soul in Saltwind knew the stories. The beast of the Blackwood, the king's shadow, a creature of nightmare that haunted the edges of the kingdom. They said it was the ghost of a slain enemy, a curse given flesh. They said it was madness itself. They said the Alpha King, Kaelin, allowed it to roam as a warning to his enemies. It had never come this close to the village before. The children saw it too. A little boy named Finn let out a thin, terrified wail. The sound cut through the heavy air, and the beast's head snapped up. 2 points of silver light ignited in the gloom of its face, its eyes. They fixed on the small, trembling cluster of children. It took a step forward. Something inside Ilara broke. Not with a snap, but with a surge of searing heat that burned away her own fear. The pain in her leg, the cold in her bones, the years of being useless and overlooked. It all vanished, replaced by a single crystalline thought. No. Her hand, clumsy with cold, fumbled on the shingle beside her. Her fingers closed around a stone. It was a good one, flat and heavy, worn smooth by the relentless tide. She didn't think. She didn't weigh the consequences of provoking a legend. Pushing off the boat, she ignored the shriek of protest from her hip. She put all her weight on her good leg, her body a coiled spring of pure, protective fury. With a grunt of effort that tore from her throat, she threw the stone. She had a strong arm, one of the few parts of her that hadn't been betrayed by her own body. The stone flew true, a dark little missile against the gray. It struck the beast high on its massive flank with a dull thud. The creature flinched, a full-body shudder, and let out a low sound. It wasn't a roar of anger. It was a grunt of surprise, almost of indignation. It turned its head, those silver eyes leaving the children and locking onto her. Ilara stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She braced herself for the charge, for the feeling of those claws, for the end. This was it. A stupid, impulsive act, and she would die for it. But the children would have a chance to run. It was a worthy trade. The beast did not charge. It simply stared at her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. It took a slow step, not toward her, but toward where the stone had fallen. It lowered its enormous head, sniffing at the shingle. Then, with a delicacy that was utterly at odds with its terrifying form, it picked up the stone in its jaws. Ilara's breath hitched. This was not in the stories. The beast turned back to her. It walked forward, its movements slow, deliberate, its silver eyes never leaving her face. It didn't radiate menace now, but something else. Something she couldn't name. A cautious curiosity. It stopped a dozen feet from her, a chasm of damp beach between them. The children were silent behind her, frozen in a terror that had turned to awe. With another deliberate movement, the beast lowered its head and opened its mouth. The stone dropped onto the wet shingle, a soft clatter that sounded like a thunderclap in the stillness. It brought the stone back. It looked from the stone to her face, a clear, unmistakable gesture. A question, an invitation, a game. Her fury dissolved, replaced by a profound and dizzying confusion. This wasn't a mindless monster. This wasn't a raging curse. This was something else, something intelligent. And in the depths of those silver eyes, beneath the predatory gleam, she saw a flicker of something she knew intimately: loneliness. The fog swirled around them, a curtain closing on a scene that no one would ever believe. The beast stood, waiting. Ilara stood, her bad leg screaming in protest, her mind reeling. She had thrown a stone at a nightmare, and the nightmare had asked her to play. The spell was broken by a shout from the village path. "Ilara, get the children inside. The fog is too thick." She tore her gaze from the beast, her heart sinking. She looked back at it, a silent apology in her eyes. When she turned back to usher the children away, a wave of dizziness hit her, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush. The pain in her leg returned with a vengeance, and she stumbled, catching herself on the boat. When she looked back at the spot where the beast had stood, it was gone. The fog had swallowed it whole. All that remained was the stone, dark and wet upon the gray shingle. A silent testament to the impossible moment. For days the encounter haunted her. She replayed it in her mind, the weight of the stone in her hand, the thud of its impact, the shocking gentleness of its return. The villagers whispered about the beast being so close, a bad omen. Ilara stayed silent. How could she explain what she had seen? That she had looked into the eyes of a monster and found a soul? Her leg ached more than usual, a deep, throbbing reminder of her own frailty. But the ache was different now. It was twinned with a strange restlessness, a pull toward the misty cliffs and the blackwood beyond. A week later, a storm rolled in, a true coastal fury that rattled the cottage and sent waves crashing over the sea wall. One of the fishermen, a young man named Wren, had been caught out in it, his boat smashed to pieces on the black rocks where she had first seen the beast. They brought him back barely breathing, his body broken and cold. The village healer did what she could, but his breathing was shallow, his life flickering like a spent candle. The mood in Saltwind was grim. Wren was well loved, his wife pregnant with their first child. Ilara couldn't bear to stay in the village, to feel the weight of their collective grief. She bundled herself in her thickest cloak and limped her way out toward the cliffs, seeking the cold comfort of the wind and sea. The path was treacherous, slick with rain, and each step was a battle. She found herself drawn back to the shingle beach, now a maelstrom of churning gray water and flying spray. And there, tangled in the wreckage of Wren's boat, was a dark shape. It was the beast. It was trapped. A thick, heavy fishing net, reinforced with iron rings, was wrapped tight around its forelegs and torso. A jagged piece of the boat's mast was pinned against its side, a cruel spear that had gouged a deep wound in its flank. Dark blood, almost black, stained its fur and the surrounding stones. It was alive, but barely. Its silver eyes were dull, clouded with pain. Its massive chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. It didn't even seem to notice her approach over the roar of the storm. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a surge of something else: pity. a fierce, aching empathy for this creature that everyone feared, now brought low and dying alone in the storm. The creature that had brought her stone back. She made a choice. "I'm here," she called out, her voice nearly stolen by the wind. "I'm not going to hurt you." The beast's head lifted a fraction of an inch, its eyes focused on her, a glimmer of recognition in their pained depths. There was no threat in them, only exhaustion and a kind of weary surrender. Her leg was agony as she scrambled over the slippery rocks and debris. She reached its side, her small form dwarfed by its immense wounded body. The wound was worse up close, a ragged tear oozing blood. The net was a merciless tangle, cutting into its flesh with every pained breath. "All right," she whispered, more to herself than to the creature. "All right. Let's see about this." She carried a small, sharp knife for mending nets. Her fingers were numb with cold as she drew it. She started with the net, sawing at the thick, wet ropes. It was slow, arduous work. The storm howled around them, drenching her to the bone. The beast lay utterly still, its trust a heavy, fragile weight upon her. Hours seemed to pass. Rope by rope, she cut it free. Finally, the main tangle loosened. Now for the mast. It was too heavy for her to lift. She leaned against it, pushing with all her might, her bad leg screaming in protest. It wouldn't budge. "You have to help me," she grunted, her face close to its great head. Its ear twitched. "I can't move it alone. You have to push." It seemed to understand. With a low groan that vibrated through the stones, the beast gathered what little strength it had. As she pushed, it shifted its massive weight. The mast scraped, groaned, and then rolled free, clattering down the shingle. The beast slumped back, its breathing even more shallow than before. The wound in its side was now clear, and it was bleeding freely. It was dying. Panic seized her. She couldn't leave it. She pressed her hands against the wound, a futile gesture against the steady flow of blood. The fur was coarse and thick, matted with salt and blood. Underneath, its skin was hot with fever. "No," she whispered, the word a fierce prayer against the wind. "You don't die. Not after this. Not alone." She stayed with it as the storm raged and the light faded from the sky. She talked to it, her voice a low, steady murmur. She told it about the children, about the ache in her leg, about the grayness of her life. She poured out all her own loneliness to this creature, a confession in the heart of the tempest. The beast listened, its silver eyes fixed on her. Its breathing steadied, the shudders racking its body began to ease. It seemed to draw strength from her presence, from the sound of her voice. When the first hint of dawn broke the horizon, the storm had passed. The beast was still alive. Ilara was exhausted, freezing, and in more pain than she had ever known. But a strange sense of peace settled over her. She had saved it. She knew she couldn't leave it on the beach. The villagers would find it. They would finish the job the storm had started. There was a small hidden cave nearby, concealed by a curtain of sea-worn rock. She had played there as a child before her fall. "Can you walk?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "You have to get up. We have to hide you." It watched her. Then with a monumental effort it began to stir. It pushed itself up, its legs trembling. It leaned heavily against her, and she nearly buckled under the weight, but she held firm. Step by agonizing step, she guided the wounded giant into the darkness of the cave. Inside, it collapsed onto the sandy floor with a deep sigh. Ilara gathered dry seaweed and driftwood, using her flint and steel to start a small, smoky fire. The warmth was a blessing, chasing away the worst of the chill. She looked at the beast, its massive form curled in the flickering light. Its silver eyes were closed. It was sleeping. She had done it. She had rescued the monster. And in the quiet of the cave, with the sound of the sea a gentle rhythm outside, Ilara felt a sense of purpose she had never known. This creature needed her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't useless. For the next few days, the cave became their secret world. Ilara would sneak away from the village, bringing fresh water in a water skin and strips of salted fish she pilfered from the smoking sheds. She used her knowledge of herbs, meager as it was, to clean its wound, crushing sea kelp into a poultice to pack into the gash. The beast was a patient patient. It allowed her ministrations with a profound stillness, its silver eyes tracking her every move. The intelligence in them was undeniable. It would nudge her hand with its nose when the pain was too great, or let out a low rumble in its chest, a sound she came to recognize as contentment when she settled by the fire. She talked to it constantly. The words flowed out of her, secrets she had never told another soul. She spoke of her jealousy of the other girls, their strong legs and easy laughter. She spoke of her dreams of sailing away on a ship, of seeing a world that wasn't gray and damp. The beast would listen, its gaze unwavering. In its silent companionship, she felt more seen and heard than she ever had in the bustling village. A bond was forming between them, woven from shared vulnerability and quiet trust. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for years began to recede, replaced by a tentative warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. One evening, she arrived to find the cave empty. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped her. Had it left? Had its strength returned? And it had no more use for her? Or worse, had someone found it? She called its name, a name she had given it in her own mind. Shadow. A noise came from the back of the cave, a part she had never explored. It was a human sound, a cough. Ilara's heart hammered. She grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it aloft as a torch. She crept deeper into the darkness, her bad leg dragging on the sandy floor. And then she saw him. He was lying where the beast should have been. A man. He was naked. His body a roadmap of old scars that crisscrossed a powerful musculature. More recent was the raw, healing gash on his side, the same wound she had been tending. His hair was long and black as a raven's wing, fanned out on the sand. As she stared, he stirred, rolling onto his back with a groan. His face was harsh, beautiful in the way of a storm-ravaged cliff, all sharp angles and stark lines. Even in sleep, his brow was furrowed with a pain that looked ancient. Ilara's torch wavered, casting dancing shadows. The man, the wound. The impossible truth slammed into her. He was the beast. His eyes fluttered open. They were not silver now, but a deep, startling gray, the color of the sea before a storm. They focused on her, and the confusion in them was swiftly replaced by a guarded, intense wariness. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice a low thunder she recognized from the rumbles in the beast's chest. Ilara couldn't speak. She could only stare at the Alpha King. Kaelin, the ruler of their lands, the man of legend and fear, was lying wounded in her secret cave. She had been tending to the king of the Blackwood as if he were a stray dog. "You," he said, pushing himself up on one elbow, his gaze sharpening. He looked at her face, then down at her leg, then back to her face. The girl on the beach. The one with the stone. The burning branch slipped from her fingers, extinguishing in the damp sand and plunging them into near darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the fire from the cave's mouth. Her world had just tilted on its axis, and she was falling. "Your Majesty," she whispered, the words feeling alien in her mouth. She automatically tried to curtsy, a clumsy, painful gesture that made her hip cry out. "Don't," he commanded, his voice sharp but not unkind. He winced, his hand going to the wound on his side. "It seems I owe you my life." Ilara found her voice, though it was thin and trembling. I found you. In the storm. I didn't know." "No," he said, his gray eyes searching her face in the dim light. "You wouldn't have. No one knows." His expression was grim, shadowed by a pain that had nothing to do with his physical wound. "This is a curse I bear alone." The guilt. She saw it now, raw and exposed in his human face. The terrible past act the randomization card had spoken of. This transformation wasn't a tool of power. It was a punishment. A penance. "I brought you blankets," she said numbly, gesturing to the bundle she had dropped. It was all she could think to say. Practicalities. The world-shattering revelation could wait. The king was cold. He gave a short, rough sound that might have been a laugh. "Thank you." He pulled one of the rough wool blankets around his shoulders, his movements stiff with pain. "You have been kind." He said the word as if it were foreign, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Thus began the second phase of her caretaking. It was infinitely more awkward. Before, she had been tending to Shadow, her silent, grateful beast. Now she was hiding the Alpha King of the entire realm. He was a terrible patient. He was proud and stubborn, trying to stand before he could, pushing himself too hard. He was also silent, wrapped in a brooding melancholy that was more intimidating than his beastly form had ever been. But Alara was not easily intimidated. She had faced down the nightmare version of him. This quiet, broken man was less frightening. "You need to eat," she would say, pushing a bowl of fish stew toward him. "I'm not hungry." "You will eat," she would insist, her voice firm, "or you'll never heal. And then, what am I supposed to do with you?" He would look at her then, a flicker of surprise in his stormy eyes, and he would eat. Slowly, he began to talk. Not about the curse, or his kingdom, but small things. He asked about her leg. She told him about the fall, the botched healing, the life it had consigned her to. He listened, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. She learned to read the nuances of his silence. A tightening of his jaw meant his guilt was closing in. A distant look in his eyes meant he was thinking of the life outside the cave, the kingdom he had abandoned. One night, as the fire crackled between them, he spoke of it. "It was my fault," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My pack. My first pack. Years ago. There was a blood rage, an old weakness in our line. I lost control. By the time I came to myself..." He trailed off, his jaw clenching so hard she could see the muscles bunch. "They were all gone. My brother. My beta. My friends. I killed them." The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. This was his guilt. This was the source of the beast. Not a curse from an enemy, but a poison from within. The transformation was his soul's attempt to cage the violence, to turn it into something separate from the man, the king. "So I left," he continued, his voice hollow. "I gave the regency to my council. I let the stories grow. The beast of the Blackwood. Better they fear a monster than know their king is one." Alara's heart ached for him. For the centuries of loneliness he must have endured, trapped in a cycle of guilt and monstrous transformation. "You are not a monster," she said, her voice fierce. "A monster would not have brought the stone back." His head snapped up, his gray eyes locking on hers. He stared at her for a long moment, and in their depths, she saw something break. The icy wall of his control fractured, and a raw, desperate vulnerability bled through. "Why?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why do you stay? Why do you help me? Everyone else runs." "Because you didn't run," she said simply. "That day on the beach, you were the monster of legend and you could have torn us all apart. But you saw the children, and you stopped. And when I hurt you, you were gentle." She took a breath. "Because when I look at you, beast or man, I see someone who is just as trapped as I am." The connection between them deepened, no longer just caretaker and patient. It was two broken people finding solace in a hidden cave, their shared wounds a bridge between two vastly different worlds. He would watch her as she moved, his gaze intense. She would find herself breathless when his hand brushed hers as he took a bowl from her. His strength returned, The wound on his side was now a puckered scar. He was beginning to look like a king again, his power a palpable aura that filled the small space. The time for hiding was coming to an end. They both knew it. And the thought of him leaving, of returning to her gray, empty life, was a colder fear than any beast had ever inspired. The outside world, however, was not content to wait. Lady Seraphina, the ambitious daughter of a high-ranking council member, had grown impatient. For years, she had positioned herself to be Kaelin's queen, a perfect picture of high-born grace and political savvy. The king's continued absence and rumored madness were an insult to her ambition. Rumors of the beast's activity near Saltwind had reached the capital, and whispers followed, of a lame girl who had been seen near the cliffs, who seemed to have no fear of the creature. Seraphina arrived in Saltwind like a sharp, aristocratic storm. She was beautiful, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of ice. She moved with a confidence that made everyone around her feel clumsy and insignificant. Elara saw her walking through the village, her fine silks a stark contrast to the rough wool of the fisherfolk, and felt a profound sense of dread. Seraphina's inquiries were subtle at first. She spoke to the villagers, her voice dripping with false concern. She learned of Elara, the quiet, crippled girl who watched the children, the one who had been on the beach the day the beast appeared. Her questioning led her to Finn, the little boy who had first cried out. With a sweet smile and a piece of candied fruit, she coaxed the story from him, how the beast had come, how Elara had thrown the stone, and how the monster hadn't attacked. How Elara had been disappearing for hours at a time ever since the big storm. The pieces clicked into place for Seraphina. This wasn't just a girl and a monster. This was a connection. And any connection the king had that wasn't with her was a threat. Her plan was cruel and simple. She couldn't attack the king directly, but she could destroy the thing he cared for. She would tear down this girl, and in doing so, prove her own worth and necessity to the kingdom. The confrontation came when Elara was in the village, gathering supplies. Seraphina, flanked by two of the king's household guard who had accompanied her, cornered Elara in the narrow lane behind the smokehouse. "The lame girl," Seraphina said, her voice smooth as polished ice. She circled Elara like a predator. "They say you have a strange affinity for the king's pet monster. They say you meet it in secret." Elara's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Seraphina purred. "You see, the king is a troubled man. He needs a strong queen to guide him, to anchor him. Not a broken little stray he's taken a fancy to. Your existence is an inconvenience." This was the direct confrontation. The threat made plain. "Stay away from him," Elara said, her voice shaking but firm. Seraphina laughed, a tinkling, merciless sound. "You have it backward, little bird. He needs to stay away from you. You are a weakness he cannot afford." She leaned in close, her perfume cloying. "And I always remove inconveniences." Seraphina's victory was swift and brutal. She didn't need proof, only accusation. She returned to the village square and announced that she had discovered the source of the beast's recent boldness. A village girl, a cripple named Elara, was in league with it. She was using witchcraft to lure it close to the village, endangering the children. The seeds of fear Seraphina planted took root in fertile ground. The villagers remembered the beast on the beach. They remembered Elara's strange, solitary ways. They saw her limp, her otherness, and it became twisted into something sinister. But accusation wasn't enough. Seraphina needed an event. She arranged an accident. She had one of her guardsmen start a rock slide on the cliffs above the children's beach while Finn was playing there. It was meant to look like the beast had been flushed from the heights and caused the slide in its panic. The plan went horribly right. Rocks tumbled down. Finn screamed. But Kaelin, who had grown worried by Elara's long absence, had ventured out of the cave. He heard the boys cry and saw the rock slide. Moving with a speed that was not quite human, he reached the boy, shielding him with his own body as stones rained down. He saved Finn's life, but a large boulder struck his head, and he collapsed, unconscious. When the villagers arrived, they saw a horrifying scene. The boy, crying but unharmed. The strange, scarred man who had saved him, bleeding and unconscious. And Alara, who had just arrived, rushing to his side. Seraphina sealed the narrative. "You see?" she cried, pointing a trembling, dramatic finger. "The witch and her familiar. She brought this strange man here, another of her dark minions. They caused this, trying to harm our children." It was a lie, but it was a lie they wanted to believe. It made sense of the fear. They turned on Alara. Ren's wife, her face contorted with grief and fear, spat at her. "My husband was smashed on those rocks. Was that you too, witch?" The king's guards, under Seraphina's command, seized Alara. They dragged Kaelin's unconscious form away, to be dealt with by the council. Alara was thrown into the village's cold, damp holding cell. The heavy oak door slammed shut, and the bolt slid home. The darkness that enveloped her was absolute. Seraphina had won. She had separated them, turned the world against Alara, and taken possession of the king. From her cell, Alara could hear the villagers celebrating Lady Seraphina, their savior. She was alone, branded a witch, her king captured, and her heart a cold, dead stone in her chest. The second half of her life, the battle back from this abyss, had just begun. The days in the cell bled into one another, a smear of cold and despair. They gave her stale bread and brackish water, just enough to keep her alive for the trial Seraphina was arranging. The damp stone leached the warmth from her body, and the pain in her leg became a constant roaring fire. But it was nothing compared to the agony in her soul. Where was Kaelin? Was he even alive? Had he woken up? Or had Seraphina already disposed of him, the inconvenient broken king? The thought was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Without him, the world was just gray again, but a darker, more hopeless shade than before. She thought of his beast form, the silent companionship, the trust in his silver eyes. She thought of his human form, the raw guilt in his storm-gray gaze, the way he had looked at her, as if she were the first light he'd seen in a century. She had saved him from the storm, and he had saved her from her loneliness. Now, they were both lost. Meanwhile, Kaelin had woken in a lavish room in the governor's keep, a place he hadn't seen in years. Seraphina was at his bedside, all gentle hands and concerned whispers. "Your Majesty," she breathed, her relief exquisitely performed. "You're awake. You were injured saving that boy. It was heroic." His head throbbed. Memories were returning in fractured shards. The rock slide. Finn's scream. Alara's face, panicked as she ran toward him. "Alara," he rasped. "Where is she?" Seraphina's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "The witch?" "She is being held, Your Majesty. She confessed to everything. She orchestrated the rock slide, using her dark arts to control you and harm the child. I saved him. I saved you." A cold rage, more terrifying than any beastly transformation, began to build in Kaelin's chest. He knew Seraphina. He knew her ambition. And he knew Alara. Alara, who had faced down his beast form to protect children. Alara, who had tended his wounds with gentle, calloused hands. Alara, who had spoken truth to his centuries of guilt. "Liar," he growled, the single word cracking with power. He sat up, ignoring the splitting pain in his head. The aura of the Alpha King filled the room, immense and suffocating. Seraphina took an involuntary step back, her mask of concern falling away to reveal a flicker of fear. "Your Majesty, you are confused," she stammered. "The blow to your head?" "My mind has never been clearer," he snarled. "You will release her. Now." But Seraphina had been clever. She had sent missives to the capital. The council was already on its way. She had positioned this not as a simple village matter, but as a threat to the stability of the throne. The king, long absent and rumored mad, had been enthralled by a witch who had attempted to murder a child. It was a power play, and Kaelin was the pawn. "I'm afraid I cannot do that, Your Majesty," she said, regaining her composure. "It is a matter for the full council. For the good of the kingdom, we must see this trial through." He was trapped. Physically weak, politically outmaneuvered. If he used his full power now, it would only confirm their fears of his instability. He was a king in a cage, while the only person who had ever seen the man inside the king and the beast was rotting in a cell. The crisis point was approaching. Seraphina, knowing her position was tenuous as long as the boy, Finn, could speak the truth, decided to remove the last witness. The trial was in 2 days. She needed to silence him before then. She went to the boy's home under the cover of night, dismissing his parents with a sharp command. She carried a small vial, a fast-acting poison that would mimic a sudden fever. But she had underestimated her opponents. Ilara, in her cell, had not given up. She had been studying the old iron lock, the rusted hinges. She used a piece of wire from her own stiff undergarment, her fingers working with a desperate patience. After hours of agonizing effort, she felt the tumblers click. The door swung open with a low groan. She was free, but weak and in agony. Every step was a fresh torment, but she had to get to him. She had to know. Kaelin, for his part, was not idle. He was a king, and he had allies, even if they were long neglected. He found a loyal guard, one of the old guard who remembered him before his self-imposed exile, and sent a message. But he knew it might be too late. He could feel Seraphina's intent like a cold poison in the air. He felt it aimed not at him, but at something innocent. Finn. He broke out of his gilded cage, not with a roar, but with a quiet, deadly force. He was still injured, his power not fully settled, but the thought of Ilara and the boy in danger gave him a strength he hadn't felt in an age. Ilara, guided by a frantic intuition she didn't understand, didn't head for the cliffs. She headed for the village, for Finn's house. She saw the light in the window, heard the sharp, imperious tones of Seraphina's voice. She burst through the door, a wild, disheveled figure. She saw Seraphina standing over Finn's small bed, the vial uncorked in her hand. The boy's eyes were wide with terror. "Get away from him!" Ilara screamed. Seraphina spun around, her face a mask of fury. "You! How did you escape?" She lunged, not at Ilara, but at the boy, intending to force the poison down his throat. At that exact moment, Kaelin arrived, filling the doorway. He saw the scene. Seraphina, the poison, the terrified child, and Ilara, standing between them, a fierce, protective shield despite her own frailty. "Seraphina!" he roared, his voice the thunder of the Alpha King. Startled, Seraphina dropped the vial, but her rage was too great. She drew a hidden dagger, its blade coated with the same poison. "If I cannot have the throne," she shrieked, her sanity fraying, "then no one will. Your weakness will die with you." She didn't lunge for Kaelin. She lunged for Ilara. Everything happened in a heartbeat. Kaelin moved to intercept her, but he was too far. Ilara tried to dodge, but her leg betrayed her. The dagger plunged deep into Kaelin's side as he threw himself in front of Ilara, taking the blow meant for her. He staggered back with a sharp cry of pain, clutching his side. The very spot she had tended in the cave. The poison was potent. A deathly pallor spread over his face, and his legs buckled. He collapsed to the floor, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Seraphina stood over him, laughing, a wild, unhinged sound. "It is done. The beast is slain." Ilara fell to her knees beside Kaelin. His skin was turning cold, his storm-gray eyes dimming. He looked at her, his lips moving, trying to form words. "I'm sorry," he whispered, a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. "I couldn't protect you." "Don't," she sobbed, pressing her hands to his wound, just as she had done in the storm. But this time, the blood was flowing faster, and a strange, dark energy was emanating from the wound, the poison devouring his life force. He reached up, his trembling hand cupping her cheek. His touch was icy. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice fading. I love you." The words, spoken at the brink of death, were not a joyous revelation. They were a tragedy, a final, desperate confession in a world that was ending. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. Then, the whisper grew into a roar of pure defiance. "No, I will not let you die." She leaned over him, her tears falling on his cold face. She refused to accept this. She refused to let Serafina win. She refused to lose him, the one person who had ever truly seen her. Her love for him, her fierce, protective rage, her grief. It all coalesced into a single burning point of power inside her chest. It was a fire she had never known she possessed. She pressed her hands harder against his wound, not trying to stop the bleeding now, but pouring all of herself into him. All her pain, all her hope, all her love. "You are not a monster," she chanted, the words from the cave becoming a litany, an anchor. "You are not a monster. You are Kaelin, and you are mine." The mate bond, forged in the cave through care and vulnerability, flared to life. Her latent power, bond amplification, erupted. A wave of pure, golden light exploded from her hands, engulfing them both. It wasn't just her energy, it was as if she had become a conduit, a lens, focusing the very essence of their connection. The power surged into Kaelin. It didn't just fight the poison, it annihilated it. It didn't just heal the wound, it supercharged his own life force, his alpha power, his dormant wolf. The curse, the guilt, the ancient wound in his soul. It was all caught in the searing, cleansing fire of her love. He gasped, his eyes flying open. The gray was no longer stormy. It was clear and bright, and in their depths, flecks of pure silver ignited. The cold receded, replaced by a furnace heat. He felt the power, not just his own restored, but hers, intertwined with his, making them something more. Serafina stared, her face a mask of horrified disbelief, as Kaelin rose to his feet. He was no longer the broken man or the cursed beast. He was the Alpha King, whole and terrible in his glory, with Ilara standing beside him, her hand in his, the golden light still shimmering around her. "It's over, Serafina," he said, his voice calm and absolute. The council arrived to find a scene of impossible reckoning. A terrified but living child, a shattered vial of poison, and their king, radiant with power, his hand joined with the crippled witch, who looked more regal than any queen they had ever seen. The truth, in the face of such power, was undeniable. Months later, the coastal winds were gentler, carrying the scent of salt and sun, not fog and fear. Ilara stood on the balcony of the king's castle overlooking the sea. It was the same sea, the same sky, but the colors felt different, brighter. The pain in her leg was still there, a dull, familiar ache that was part of her. But it no longer defined her. It was just a line in her story, not the whole book. Kaelin came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his presence a solid, comforting warmth. He was no longer haunted. The guilt was still part of his past, but it was a scar now, not an open wound. She had not erased his history. She had given him a future. "The council is still trying to understand your power," he murmured into her hair. "They call it the Queen's Light." Ilara smiled. "It's not my power. It's ours." Her ability was to amplify the bond, to make them stronger together than they could ever be apart. She was his anchor, and he was her strength. A perfect, balanced equation. Down below, in the castle courtyard, she could see Finn playing with a young wolf pup, a gift from the king. The pup was clumsy and boisterous, tumbling over its own paws, Finn's laughter drifted up to them, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. They had saved him. Together. They called me the lame girl, she said softly, watching the waves. The broken one. The witch. And I was the monster, Kalen replied, his voice deep and sure. He turned her in his arms, his silver-flecked eyes full of a love that was as vast and deep as the sea before them. Now, they call you queen. And you have taught this monster how to be a man. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle press of lips that held no desperation or sorrow, only a profound and lasting peace. She belonged. Here, with him. She was not a broken thing to be fixed, but a vital, powerful woman who had faced a nightmare and refused to run. She had thrown a stone, and in return, he had given her a kingdom, a home, and a love that had risen from the ashes of their shared pain. The world was no longer gray. It was vibrant, alive, and utterly, completely theirs.